Welcome, weary traveler. If you're watching this, you're probably interested in the Electron model cycles, and wondering either what makes it unique and worth getting now, or maybe looking to rule it out and figure out if you should look elsewhere. Either way, I've got you covered. I'm going to go hands-on with this in a second and walk you through what makes it unique and potentially either worth getting or worth skipping depending on what you're after. But before I go hands-on with it, let me quickly lay out my thesis, which is just going to help frame the discussion and will make more sense as we dig into it. First, the Model Cycles is one of the very few budget compact groove boxes that is synthesis-based rather than sample-based. Second, that synthesis is FM, which gives it a very particular sound, and we'll definitely be digging deeper into what the ramifications of that are. And third, you can definitely think of it as a drum machine, or it can function a lot like a groove box if you're fine with its aforementioned very particular sound. Also, I should mention I'm going to be doing a very brief comparison between the cycles and the recently released Syntakt at the end of this video, so be sure to stick around. All that being said, let's jump into this thing hands-on. So, at its core, the Model Cycles is a 6-track synthesizer, drum synthesizer, FM synthesizer, groovebox thing. Like a lot of other Electron devices, each track can only play one sound at a time, but you can switch between multiple sounds and indeed multiple sound engines over the course of one track. You've got your step sequencer laid out here, and this can also function as a chromatic sample player. One of my absolute biggest gripes with the cycles is its big pads. You'll notice I have to lay into them quite a bit to get full volume out of them. And even if you adjust the velocity curves, which I have done, they're kind of just unplayable, in my opinion. I definitely place a lot of emphasis on finger drumming when it comes to my music production experience, especially for groove boxes. This is pretty bad as far as finger drumming goes. So I pretty much only use these as sound selection and muting and unmuting. For the rest of the time, I'm playing these pads, which is easy enough. When I was first going down the groovebox rabbit hole and checking this out, it seemed really promising, like it would solve a lot of the problems with other grooveboxes, like, say, the Innovation Circuit, which doesn't let you do much sound design in a hands-on way, whereas this has a bunch of knobs for sound design and a bunch of dedicated controls. And it also seemed like, oh, hey, it's more tracks, and so it'll give me more layers to work with, therefore be a better complete song creation machine, which is not quite how that panned out. Turns out that it definitely sits somewhere between groovebox and drum machine, and if I was to use this for full tracks, I would probably lean towards using it more as a drum machine, or I would record each of the individual tracks into my DAW just by muting and unmuting stuff, which I've done a dedicated video on. I'll link that at the end of this one to make a full song, because some of this stuff just raw in the box sounds, well, like I mentioned, a very particular way. So let's dive deeper into each sound engine. By far my favorite is the kick. It sounds quite powerful just on its own. Right now I'm distorting it a bit. And we'll get back to that distortion in a bit. At its core, sounds fairly sine-like. So let's say I turn up color a bit. You're going to start to hear a more defined attack. So it's very low and heavy, unmodified, straight out of the box. But it's got some either nice thumpiness or some nice bite to it. And in that sense, this thing is basically a sample pack generator. I've designed and sampled so many kicks on this thing. Either kind of conventional, almost analog style kicks, or more gritty, punchy kicks, or more swept trance-like kicks. Or, of course, your more kind of 808 style sounds. Especially distorted. So the kick engine, quite versatile, quite powerful. kind of one of the major reasons I keep this thing around, because it's just kind of the kick synth for me. Like, just for reference, let me run you through a few presets. So there's quite a lot of stuff that this can do. Normally, I prefer to just design kicks myself because that's the fun of it. It's very hands-on. And I mentioned distortion a second ago. There are two ways to get some grit out of it. First of all, this shape knob here gets you one particular kind of grit. And then there's also this overall volume plus distortion. Now, here's the thing to be aware of. This distortion is cumulative. So anything that I send to this, like if I also send my snare to this kick and snare will be sent to the same distortion. And so if you're trying to make a big kind of hyperpop distorted style track, you have to be really careful or else stuff's going to start just getting completely clipped and lost. So I typically prefer to use the distortion either on just one or two elements or on multiple elements that are all going to be isolated and recorded into my DAW later, either one-shot samples or full tracks. Regardless, here's an example of what this can sound like if you just distort a bunch of stuff. This is some kind of hyperpop style stuff, and you can hear how this kick sounds super distorted. The snare is also quite distorted and sounds quite metallic. This is about as punchy as the snare engine will ever be, by the way. Beyond that, it often can sound kind of dinky, which if you lean into it is great, or in this case, kind of sharp and metallic. And of course, you'll notice that this does sound kind of nasty, which in this case is intentional, but not always what you want, so use the distortion with caution. All that being said, this leads us pretty well into the snare engine. And I've already mentioned it can sound kind of dinky and occasionally a bit stronger if finagled very carefully. But often what I prefer to do, let me get rid of this reverb send. It does have a nice sharp attack to it if you want it to. And that's kind of its raw form. Usually for the snare, I find it best to lean into the dinkiness. For instance, it can take on kind of an 808 type quality, especially if you pitch it up quite a bit more. And in that case, I've even sampled the dinky snare and used it on Not the Cycles. Once again, I really like using this as a drum designer, first and foremost. Just a fun, hands-on way to design drum sounds and then harvest them for other use. Which, for something that is this budget and sounds the way it does, that's pretty unique. Like, you can replicate pretty much all the stuff that this does in the Syntakt, more on that later, but of course that's way more freaking expensive and less portable. There's not a whole lot to talk about with the hi-hat. It's fine. It sounds fairly metallic. It is called the metal. That's the name of the engine. You can get it to sound a little more white noisy, which I typically prefer. In which case, once again, I've literally used samples of this. And I should also mention, a bunch of Model Cycle samples are in my $5 sample pack, which is linked in the description. Helps support the channel. So that's a bit of more of a traditional hip-hop hi-hat. And I should also mention, when you crank up the decay, that's how you're going to get an open hi-hat. And once again, you can switch between the decay being open and closed on a step-by-step basis on the step sequencer. And I've actually used samples of the open hi-hat a ton. It sounds fairly unique, fairly distinct, but fits in a mix pretty well. Up next is the Perc engine, the percussion engine. It can sound nice. Personally, I pretty much never use it. And finally, let's talk about the two kind of main synth engines that you'd use for melodic or harmonic stuff. Once again, FM based. So this is the main synth engine. And right now I've intentionally crushed it a bit. So this right here is basically just a sine wave. And then we start adding FM elements. And it gets often kind of what I would describe as plinky. either kind of plinky or very punchy. For instance, here's another preset that I would describe as very plinky. And you can get some more sustained stuff. Or even something like this. And one of my most used synth sounds is some variation of this bass. Like I said, it can get quite punchy. So you get quite a bit of hands-on control, and it's kind of a safe environment to explore FM, if that makes sense. You're unlikely to make something horrible sounding, and you've got some options to work with. It might not always sound great, but it's a good introduction to a very hands-on way to working with FM. And you can hear that harshness coming in, which sometimes it actually is really fun to embrace. So there's that harshness I was talking about. I probably wouldn't use this for like proper bass music sound design necessarily. Like you could probably get some kind of Skrillexy stuff with it. I don't think it's really meant for that. What you're gonna mostly be doing is probably stuff more like this. So once again, plinky sound, and then this kind of large space-filling sound that's a little more smooth. And speaking of smooth, let's talk about the Chord engine. This really does help with the machine being monophonic, but it also kind of immediately makes the sound of the motorcycles identifiable. But it is actually surprisingly versatile. So here's the first thing that I really want to put in your brain. This is still just sending out one note. Each of these is just one note. The chord data is contained within the oscillator itself. We've got all these different ones to choose from. Like major 7th, diminished 7th, 9ths, so on and so forth. If you were to sequence another device with MIDI from this, it would still just send out one note. So keep that in mind. And in fact, you could actually use that to your advantage if you wanted to, say, control a bass synth with this. You could have your chords going on this track and then just send out the singular kind of root notes. And we've got a ton of different sound shaping parameters to work with. This chord sweep especially can be really fun to modulate because, did I mention, we have an LFO in here, which is lovely. And you can only send that to one destination at a time, but often LFOing one destination at a time on a track-by-track basis, that is, so 6 LFOs total, 1 per track. And you can get some really nice movement, especially out of stuff like the Chord and Synth engine. And it's also fun for, say, a hi-hat pitching or panning around as you go. So you're gonna get some kind of weird textures. Or let's send that, like I mentioned earlier, to sweep. This is usually best kept subtle. So let's dial that back a bit. Once again, it often gets a little bit harsh, a little bit metallic, kind of a lot of electric piano and organ type sounds. Let's just bring it all the way for good measure. So you're going to get a very particular kind of tonality out of it, but it does do what it does quite well. And with some clever use of modulation, it can sound quite different. Also, you might notice that this is chromatic, which means that sometimes trying to tap out a melody on it can feel a little unnatural, but you will get used to that. So, like I've hopefully showed so far, as an introduction to hands-on drum synthesis or FM synthesis within kind of narrow parameters, this can be really fun. And you're not really going to find anything else that sounds like this or that gives you the hands-on controls to shape the sounds in the way that it does, especially at this price point. At higher price points, you have stuff like the Digitone or Syntakt, but at this price point, this stands alone in the way it sounds and in the way that it lets you manipulate those sounds. But like I said, it's a pretty narrow band of the full spectrum of what's available in sound design. And so a lot of tracks will sound just a little bit empty or a little bit samey, even if you really go for all the variation this thing can offer. Like, let me play something in a completely different genre. Some kind of fun dark inharmonic stuff, or maybe something a little more hip-hop influenced. Still has a very particular sound. So personally, in my own personal music production process, I find myself using this thing in fits and starts. Like, I'll get the bug to just design an absolute ton of drum sounds, or maybe some synth sounds on the slightly harsher side. And I'll end up making a bunch of little individual ideas with it, and then either export them or just kind of let them stay just that, little ideas. That's how it fits into my workflow personally. You might be able to get even more mileage out of it. I've seen people make some ambient stuff with it, and once again, if this sound fits the sound that you're looking for, I think you'll have a great time with it. I should also mention, like a lot of other Electron devices, it's limited to 4 bars only, which is a damn shame, but they're committed to that for whatever reason, so keep that in mind as well. Or of course, this also functions great as a drum machine within a bigger setup, although personally, I don't typically run setups like that. So I mentioned I was going to compare it to the Syntakt. The way to think of this now that the Syntakt is out is the Cycles is basically like a diet Syntakt. It has quite a few fewer engines to work with and fewer controls for those. For instance, this doesn't have a filter. The Syntakt does have all sorts of filters to work with so that you can get proper, like, resonant high-low pass filter sweeps, all that kind of thing. Also, for instance, you know, this kick is lovely, but there are multiple kick engines on the Syntakt, including analog ones, because it has some analog drum and synth tracks, which is super nice, including a more traditional dual VCO one. This doesn't have that. You're not really going to get traditional synth sounds out of this thing most of the time. Also, the only way to get a clap on the Cycles is to basically hack the Chord engine, and they have presets built in to do that, so you can just load one up and tweak it, but it's not great, and the clap engine on the Syntakt is actually designed for claps and is therefore a lot better. And on the Syntakt, you have a cumulative distortion like you have on the Cycles, but you also have individual overdrive distortion for each track that does not stack on a track-by-track basis. So if you're trying to create just distorted monstrosities that don't devolve into completely clipping messes, once again, the Syntakt might be a better bet unless you're just trying to use this as basically a sample pack generator. So basically, if you want a diet Syntakt, this is going to be your go-to, whether it's for the budget or for the size, or you just don't need all of the extra functionality that the Syntakt gives you. This is a good bet. This will get you quite a bit of fun tinkering, sound design, and some good built-in presets as well. And while that was not particularly quick, that's the quick version. If you'd like to see that video where I make a full song with the Cycles, you can click or tap up over here. And if you'd like to see more of it in action, you can click or tap over here somewhere. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.